Okay, I'm Leslie Cushman. I want to welcome you to this 1-hour webinar. We are grateful for your time and are asking for you to work with us to get this focused agenda enacted. I'm a member of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. I live in Olympia. I was the citizen sponsor of I-940, one of hundreds and hundreds of people who worked to get that groundbreaking initiative into law. After 940 was enacted, the work didn't stop. The campaign ended and work began on implementation of 940. We worked closely with the Criminal Justice Training Commission. We met with prosecutors, talked to law enforcement, and had conversations with the community. We learned what was working and where the gaps were. In May, when George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis, and when the news of Manuel Ellis's murder by Tacoma police became public, we formed this coalition so that impacted families and impacted communities would have a voice in the formation of policy at the Washington State Legislature. I want to thank Chair Goodman, Chair Peterson, Representative Johnson, Entenmann, Lovick, Ty, and others for the close collaboration on bringing policies forward that reflect the lived experiences of impacted people. Today, we are going to talk about the 5 priorities you see on this slide. You will hear from coalition members who will introduce themselves as we work through this material. You can write your questions in the Q&A, and we will try to get to them during this hour at the end. If not, we will respond with a follow-up email to attendees. I want to take a moment to reflect on the lives that have been lost to police violence. Next slide, please. I want to thank ACLU for preparing this slide. You see the names of 169 Washingtonians killed over the last 5 years by police. Every year, police kill over 1,000 people across the country. These are not just words on a page. Every name is a worthy, valuable human being with a story and people who love them. These are Black Americans, Natives, Latinos, Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians, Asian Americans. These are old and young and middle-aged, gay, straight, trans. There are people here who died holding their children, unarmed people holding a cell phone, pregnant women, people killed during traffic stops, people killed because they were profiled or harassed, people with their hands up, people not reaching, people who were misunderstood or in a crisis. Our 5 priorities are founded on an acknowledgement that race and bias play a significant role in police culture and that the history of race and policing must be addressed. Our legislative priorities cannot bring these loved ones back, but our work honors their lives. Now we will hear from Davida Briscoe.
Hello, everyone. I thank you for joining us today. My name is Davida Briscoe. I am the acting director for Not This Time. I am also a member of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. Not This Time was a grassroots organization that we launched. My brother and I, Andre Taylor, and his wife, Dove Taylor, launched that grassroots organization when my brother, Shay Taylor, was killed tragically in 2016 by 2 Seattle police officers. Unanimously in the inquest hearing, they found that my brother was complying. He was not reaching. And so we launched that Not This Time to work on police accountability in Washington State. And we played a very active role in bringing I-940, in the passage of I-940. So we knew that we could not stop at just de-escalation training and mental health training. So that's why we are here, to fill those gaps and also to carry on the work of Initiative 940. This coalition centers families and communities that are impacted by police violence. We have members of this coalition include 16 families who have lost loved ones to police use of deadly force. Also, this is I-940 campaign leaders, civil rights organizations, tribes, labor unions, the faith community, and activists committed to ending the violence present in police culture and practices in Washington State. I want to hand it off now to Malou.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. My name is Malou Chavez, and I'm Deputy Director at Northwest Immigrant Rights Project. I believe police accountability is an immigrant rights issue. I'm also a member of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability, and I'm here to introduce to you our values. We believe police hold state-sanctioned power over life and death. They can de-escalate. They can treat all community members with dignity, especially those they suspect of committing crimes. We believe every person's life is sacred, and police must be held accountable for unnecessary violence. Next slide. More than 2 years have passed since I-940's passage, yet unnecessary police injuries and killings of community members continue unabated. We believe stronger measures are required to stop the violence. Next slide. We believe the community must be involved in making policy. Directly impacted families and community members must have a significant place at the table. We believe our lived experiences should inform and drive the development of policy. And next, I would like to introduce Sonia Joseph. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. I'm Sonia Joseph. My son, my 20-year-old son, was killed in the city of Kent in 2017 by Officer Roush and Davis. I got involved in this work to help save lives. House Bill 1054, Jesse Johnson is the representative that's working on the bill, and it's police tactics. The police tactics legislation bans and restricts policing practices that historically have discriminated people, Black and brown, in hot pursuits or chokeholds, and usually it escalates violence rather than de-escalates, such as the use of military equipment in communities. Tactics such as police dogs and net calls are used to intimidate and control communities. And we recognize this and we say no more. House Bill 1054 police tactics includes to prohibit chokeholds, neck restraints, unleash dogs for arrest and apprehension, tear gas. This does not ban pepper spray, military equipment, covering, badge numbers, and no-knock warrants. I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Malou.
I think it's my turn. Hi, my name is Paula Giulianotti of Next Steps Washington, founded by Annalisa and Fred Thomas, parents of the late Leonard Thomas. My background is in aerospace engineering. House Bill 1054 is about harm reduction through demilitarization. The bill seeks to disrupt the connection between the military-industrial complex and law enforcement agencies in Washington state. It bans 21st century military weapons and equipment. The ban includes armored or armed vehicles on land or air. It bans firearms or ammunition of .50 caliber or greater, and silencers like the one used by Seattle police in the killing of Sean Furr. Next slide, please. HB 1054 bans 21st century warfare weapons, including the long-range acoustic device, or LRAD. The police may say the LRAD is a voice projection device, but it's really designed to inflict pain on its victims. Deafness is a possible side effect. Next slide, please. This bill will protect Washingtonians for generations to come because the ban includes emergent technology. It bans directed energy weapons like the active denial system, which can shoot an invisible beam of energy, similar to microwave radiation, at its victims, inflicting serious pain and described like the sensation one's skin is on fire. Law enforcement may say it's for less lethal crowd control, but there's nothing inherent in the technology itself that prevents the energy output of the weapon from being dialed up to be potentially fatal. The weapon is designed to hit a region, not a point, meaning the active denial system and other EM spectrum weapons can strike multiple people simultaneously. Combine this danger with the potential of increasing the power output levels means that these weapons are both deadly and indiscriminate, and we seek to ban them in Washington state. Thank you, and I now introduce Anoka of the American Civil Liberties Union.
Hi all, my name is Inoka Herat. My pronouns are she and hers, and I'm the Police Practices and Immigration Counsel for the ACLU of Washington. And we believe that these bills are incredibly important. in particular, the tactics in the use of force bill really limit the authority and scope of police powers in our state and set an expectation that for de-escalation, et cetera. And what the tactics bill does, in addition to prohibiting the tactics and equipment that were just mentioned, is that it significantly reduces and restricts the ability for police officers to engage in vehicular pursuits or hot pursuits. And these are car chases that are incredibly dangerous. And they will be prohibited unless the driver or passenger in the car is committing a violent offense or a sex offense, and the chase is necessary to identify or arrest the person. But officers will be required to do a risk calculation of whether losing the person, whether the risk of losing the person is greater than the risk of the pursuit itself. And the pursuit has to be authorized by a supervisor and managed in that way. And this was language, if we can go back to the previous slide. This was language that we worked with Representative Lovick on, who he himself was a supervisor at the Washington State Patrol for 7 years, and he wanted to put a lot of these restrictions in place. The other thing that the bill does is it prohibits shooting at moving vehicles unless basically officers are being shot upon and a deadly weapon is being used by a driver or passenger against officers. And so these two tactics model policies will be required for those by the end of this year. And I am going to pass it on to Davida.
Thank you, Anoka. Again, this will be in alignment. This bill is in alignment with Washington State values and upholds the sanctity of life. We know that police officers hold state sanctioned power over life and death, and we believe that they should de-escalate crises rather than escalating them, and that they could stabilize dangerous situations safely and humanely, and treat the people that they suspect of committing a crime, with dignity. And so hopefully we expect our officers to use the minimum amount of force that's necessary to do their jobs. And this is a statewide policy that applies to how police do their everyday work, and sets a statewide standard for physical and deadly force. Next slide, please. Representative Johnson is the representative that is pushing the use of force and de-escalation. This is a statewide policy, again, on use of force, and it sets out a requirement to use the least amount of force that's necessary. So we are requiring that officers avoid creating the need for force, which means that they're not being aggressive and creating a situation where they are required to use deadly force. That they must exhaust all de-escalation tactics, and that includes calling for backup, using cover, creating time and distance. They must designate an officer to communicate to avoid competing commands. This which creates confusion and also creates where an officer might be required to use a weapon. They must use a minimum force necessary, taking into account the characteristics of a person. Is it a young person? Is it a pregnant woman? Is it a person in front of their children? Are they in a mental health crisis? Are they under the influence? Are they suicidal? Do they have limited English? Is it a vulnerable adult? So taking in the characteristics, and they must end the use of force as soon as necessity ends, and they must also have less lethal options available and have them ready. We believe that police can only use deadly force as a last resort. Again, emphasizing the sanctity of life and the sacredness of life when necessary to prevent serious bodily injury or death to the officers or others. And I will hand it off to Anoka again.
The second part of Representative Johnson's use of force bill tightens up the I-940 standard for criminal prosecutions. So if an officer has been charged with homicide, for example, they could they could use as a defense that the deadly force was necessary, was justifiable, but only if it was necessary. So this criminal standard really mirrors the civil standard that Davida just spoke about, that it really only allows for the use of deadly force when that force was necessary, when it was the last resort, and when there was an imminent threat. And so it aligns our values both on the civil side and on the criminal side, on the preservation of life and the proposed statewide standard on de-escalation and the duty of reasonable care. And we can go to the next slide. This is the third bill that we'll discuss today. It's Representative Mylan Tai is the prime sponsor. It's the Peace Officer Accountability Act. And the purpose of this bill is that it creates a new way to sue police officers and departments, to compensate victims, and to hold officers accountable. And the reason we need this is because the current legal paths that are available have many obstacles. And so it's very difficult actually to hold officers and departments accountable through civil litigation. And in the long term, when there is this sort of level of liability for departments, we have seen that departments change their behavior, their practices, their policies. And so that is the goal, the long-term goal for this bill. Next slide. So what this bill does is that it holds officers accountable by allowing a new path, a legal path to sue officers for misconduct such as constitutional violations, torts, which are anytime an officer violates a duty that they owe. So if something like excessive force or the violating the duty to de-escalate that was just talked about in the use of force bill. There's also, officers can also be held accountable for violations of the state law, Keep Washington Working. And that is a law that was passed a couple of years ago that prohibits information sharing and collaboration between local law enforcement and immigration officials and ICE and deportation officials. And so the reason that this bill is necessary is because for something like that, for Keep Washington Working, there aren't very many paths to actually sue officers and hold them accountable. And so this would create a way to do that. And not just officers, but also departments. And so departments could be held accountable for unreasonable hiring, training, supervising, or disciplining for misconduct. And so an example that's come to mind recently is that the Spokane Police Department just hired 4 officers that were formerly Seattle Police Department officers. And at least one of them have been, and I think actually 2 of them have been involved in fatal shootings in the past. And so if either of them then harmed someone under this bill, the department could be held accountable for even hiring them. And so this would deter officers, another tool to sort of deter departments from hiring officers who've been involved in violence in the past. It also improves access to justice because this new legal path would have attorney's fees. And that's really critical because while some forms of misconduct result in huge damages, so huge monetary costs like hospital fees, et cetera, there's a lot of misconduct and sort of routine daily harassment that police officers engage in, including things like punches and kicks and verbal harassment that they often don't get held accountable for because the impact of that might only result in a bruise. And right now, in order to bring a lawsuit against the officer for that kind of conduct, you would have to seek damages. And if the damages are only $200 for a bruise or something like that, but it costs $5,000 to bring the lawsuit, those lawsuits just don't happen. And so officers have been able to, in a sense, get away with a lot of misconduct and harassment that really undermines and harms community trust and harms community. And so this would allow for attorney's fees so people wouldn't have to pay out of pocket for the cost of that, of bringing that lawsuit. An additional thing it does is it creates a cause of action for the Attorney General's office. So the Washington State Attorney General's office could bring a lawsuit if they find a pattern and practice of a department, that is engaging in misconduct repetitively, and that's and we have something like that on the federal level, and that's why something like the consent decree was possible in Seattle. And so this would allow for our state attorney general to bring similar cases. I'm sorry, it just got noisy outside. And lastly, this new legal path would remove other obstacles such as qualified immunity, which have been shields to bringing these kinds of lawsuits against police officers and departments. Okay, next slide. And I'll hand it over to Noelle. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Noelle Parrish, and I am a loved one of Joel Nelson. Joel Nelson was killed by Officer Dietrich of Thurston County Sheriff on January 5th, 2016, so 5 years ago today. Joel was, he was unarmed, and he was, walking down the road, and as a result of that, arrest, he was ended up killed. And he is, I just want to say that he lives on with all of us today. We have been working in his family and myself for the last 5 years with I-873, I-940, and in this current coalition. I just want to give thanks to all of the representatives and the coalition members. This is not easy work, and it's something that needs to happen because the unrest will not stop until it does. It needs to happen. And so I just thank you, everyone who's interested in this. And I just want to put that out there that, like, in Joel's case, he wasn't, allegedly, he back when he had surrendered, and these officers were not granted immunity, but there's no way for us to charge at this point. It's civil suit only, like the last person was talking about, but and so it's important that we look at oversight and accountability so that we can look at that power differential for those that are acting as if they're above the law. We want to make sure that police are, just in this coalition, we have a lot of conversations about that, about no one should be above the law. So the fourth one that we're going to talk about today is Senator Patterson's Senate Bill 5051, Oversight and Accountability. This proposal is police oversight. It's one of the best in the country, that changes the criminal justice training code, or excuse me, I forget what the last C, CJTC. I apologize.
That's okay.
You're
doing great.
So
it's the Criminal Justice Training Commission.
Yeah, the commission. I always thought it was coalition. I apologize. So CJTC, this slide. Yeah, so anyway, it changes some of that power differential, and very important and key to getting impacted voices involved in police and making oversight, having community oversight and a lot of different representation is important. This also requires decertification of police officers so that they lose their license and are accountable, and again, to ensure that no one is above the law, to allow for that power differential to, in certain instances of misconduct, that decertification may be required. And then also just like having that, if people are misusing their power, that there is real consequences that the Criminal Justice Training Commission can enforce in order to kind of have that culture and that change in our criminal justice system, like, be implemented structurally. Thank you. And I'll hand it off to Tim.
Thank you, Noelle. Hashlachel Twagalapu, Sia Bisha, Tim Rainan Tidsda, Spoyala Papschad. Good day to you, honorable and noble people. My name is Tim Rainan, and I'm a member of the Puyallup tribe and a former Puyallup Tribal Council member. I currently serve as the chair of the Law and Justice Committee for the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, and I'm a member of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. I served on the Governor's Task Force on Independent Investigations of Police Use of Force, as well as the Joint Legislative Task Force on the Use of Force in Community Policing in 2016. And I served as a co-chair of De-Escalate Washington, as you've heard, the coalition that led the successful I-940 campaign in 2018. I began working on police accountability and reform efforts when one of our Puyallup tribal members, Jacqueline Sawyers, and her unborn child were killed by Tacoma police in January of 2016. Jackie was shot and killed as she tried to drive away from the police officers attempting to apprehend the man in the car with her. Tacoma police conducted the investigation of the incident involving their own officers and found the shooting justified. The Pierce County prosecutor then reviewed the investigation and concurred that the use of deadly force was justified. At the end of the day, we had police investigating police and a prosecutor who works closely with those officers from that department deciding whether the shooting was justified. And so this is exactly the type of situation that we are trying to address in this upcoming legislative session. The bill that Representative Entenmann is proposing, the independent investigation and independent prosecution bills, will eliminate this. We are going to change the ability of police to investigate police, and we're going to change police culture and improve accountability and trust of law enforcement. And so we are supporting the recommendations that the Governor's Task Force worked so hard to develop over the last 4 or 5 months. We believe that there is a conflict for police to investigate and police. We just don't think it's possible. It's impossible for them to remain impartial as they interview witnesses, conduct the investigation, review video, and make recommendations regarding their fellow officers. We also feel that no matter how carefully they do the investigation, how in good faith they do the investigation, there is still going to be this appearance of conflict, this appearance that of preference or bias in the investigation. And so, and it's going to fall short because of the difficulty of investigating colleagues. We also feel that there's a similar conflict with local prosecutors. Local prosecutors rely on these officers to do their job, to provide them evidence for their cases that they're prosecuting. And so we think it's very difficult for them to make an objective decision in charging police involved in shootings. And so we're calling upon the state legislature. I think we can go to the next slide. We're calling upon the legislature to support the task force recommendations that are being included in Representative Entenmann's bill, to set up a statewide entity to do criminal investigations of police use of deadly force, to establish a prosecutor independent of county prosecutors, to create or to establish to hire a director of this new statewide investigative agency who is non-law enforcement. Again, we can't have law enforcement investigating law enforcement. So we feel it's very important that this director of this new office be a non-law enforcement professional. At the same time, we recognize that in the beginning, we may not have enough people that are currently trained that are non-law enforcement to stand this this new agency up. And so we've asked for a transition period, a 5-year transition period that will allow us to move to a completely non-law enforcement professional criminal investigative staff within 5 years of the enactment of this bill. We're also asking that this new agency has the authority to investigate those cases that happened after I-940 was enacted, as well as those cases that happened prior to, in prior years. There's no statute of limitations on prosecuting homicides, and this should be no different for law enforcement officers, homicides perpetrated by law enforcement officers. And so that's why we're asking for this new agency to have this authority. It's very important to many of us here in the coalition. And finally, we're asking for an advisory board to be created that includes a supermajority members of the community and members of impacted families and impacted communities. The purpose of this board will to provide hiring input into the new director, as well as to provide regular performance reviews for the director as well as the department. And so, you know, this bill, along with the other bills that we've talked about today, will help us establish transparency and accountability within law enforcement, restore credibility and trust to law enforcement, and provide a pathway for justice for those families who've lost loved ones at the hands of police. And so now I'll turn it back over to Noel to share how you can all help us during this upcoming legislative session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. And how you can all help and get involved is to first of all follow our Facebook page. This is live right now on our Facebook, and you can go back and watch this later too. But you can follow our Facebook page, email us at info@wc4pa.org. If you have any questions, there's also the legislative hotline. You can contact the Chair Hanson and Representative Ty and tell them the Peace Officer Accountability Act must include a reference to Representative Johnson's use of force bill so that we can hold officers accountable for the following duty of care. You can also call and check in and support House Bill 1054. And that hearing is on January 12th. There's also some other opportunities that'll be coming forward to support bills. They'll be posted on our Facebook site. And I just want to say, you know, whatever you supporting this work, we need everyone. Whatever, talking to your friends and family, like smaller, big or small, whatever contribution that you could support, we're stronger with all, you know, united in this effort. So on the day of the hearing, you'll be able to sign in supporting the ledge.law.gov. So if you just keep an eye on our Facebook page, you'll be able to go in often and see what the agendas are for the day, for the legislative agendas, and everyone that you can support for these 5 bills and around police accountability is appreciated by families in our coalition. So there'll be other opportunities coming up as well through communications. And now I just want to, again, thank you all. And I'm going to pass it over to open it back up to Leslie if there are any questions, or if there, we can wrap it up.
That's good. Thank you, Noel. And I want to ask everyone on our panel to go off mute unless that fouls up our audio. We'll find out. We're going to address some of these questions. Maybe Anoka can handle a few that you read, and I'm going to go back on mute because I hear a lot of feedback. And maybe it's Noel's phone.
There were a couple questions about whether Department of Corrections are included in these bills. Department of Corrections are included in the tactics bill and the use of force bill. And I believe, and actually, Leslie, maybe you know whether it's included in the decertification and the independent investigations bill.
So independent investigations, and Tim can chime in here, covers custodial homicides and assaults, and it covers sexual assault by officers as well. So yes, it's covered. Let's see here. Now
There was a question about when will there likely be bill numbers for use of force and officer accountability?
Anoka.
So that we're expecting that the use of force bill is going to be dropped next week, and then it'll get a bill number, and same with the Peace Officer Accountability Act. That's what we've heard so far.
So let's talk about how our package fits together. We're trying to change police culture and reduce violence. And there's two ends of the system. We're trying to work upstream, and we think that the police tactics bill will make a big difference in reducing injuries and deaths by just taking some tactics off the table. Can't use them anymore. And then the use of force sets the standards for everyday officer behavior. It regulates the amount of force. It says when force can and can't be used. And that's about everyday work. That's upstream. The accountability pieces, we have seen in other jurisdictions that when independent investigations are put into place, the police officer involved shootings are reduced. Consequences make a difference. And so this package works together on both ends of the system. 940 focused on training. We're putting, and I thought that was a good start. This puts something right into the law that you have to de-escalate and less lethal force, and deadly force is a last resort. So we think this package makes a lot of sense. What do you got, Polly?
One of the questions from Mindy Chambers, it says, how many police killings have occurred since I-940 passed? What has its effect been on the resolution of those killings, such as discipline, prosecution, etc.? Thank you, Mindy.
So Mindy, we track the data, and if Kathy has the data, she can chime in here and maybe put it in the Q&A. There is about an average of 40 a year. Last year was 41. Let me tell you that the people of color are overrepresented in the data, and a third of the people killed are experiencing a mental health crisis, and over 25% of the people killed are Latinos. So we have lots of work to do in this state to address overrepresentation of vulnerable, marginalized, Black and brown people. We have a lot of work to do, and that's what we're doing with this package.
I have a question here from Juan. He says, we all know that white supremacy and law enforcement is responsible for many of the shootings by police across the country. Shouldn't we be demanding that white supremacy and law enforcement be addressed in the legislature if we want the shootings and killings of people of color and LGBT communities to end? And maybe somebody that was participating on the governor's task force for police use of force or independent investigations might want to answer this.
Tim, you want to talk about the background checks?
Yeah, that's exactly. That's one of the things we talked about on the task force and in our coalition is having background checks done for officers that include looking into their social media background, their affiliations with the racist organizations and those types of things. So I believe that is that's part of our recommendations, and hopefully that will be included in one of our bills.
We have another great question, this one from Allison. Can you talk about the difference between the two accountability bills, please? The one by Ty and Peterson.
can take that one. Ty's accountability bill results in civil liability. And so it allows people to sue officers and departments, and it results in financial or monetary punishments for officers and departments. And that has been one way in which you can change police behavior and police culture. Peterson's bill is sort of further down the line. It's a decertification bill. So it removes an officer's ability to actually be a law enforcement officer ever. So while one is sort of a punishment, for conduct, the other removes an individual officer from a force and prevents them from ever being on a police officer again in Washington. But in order for that to happen, there's a lot of different things that have to be triggered by the statute, in order to be decertified.
Let me tell the audience that these are our 5 priorities, but we're also going to be supporting other bills. And there's a bill called felony bar that maybe Tim can talk about in a minute, or I can talk about it. It is another accountability measure. There's a statute that prevents persons who were involved or alleged to be involved in a felony from suing the police officer that beats the crap out of them. And so that's not fair. And it wasn't really the intention of the statute. So it's an exception to this being put into the law. And Senator Fracht and Representative Lekanoff are working on that. But I also wanted to mention the hiring bill that Senator Patty Curter is working on. We're going to be looking at that. And there's bills on duty to intervene, which changes police culture, that looks at the blue code, and you are required to intervene and required to report misconduct. We think that will have a big impact. Anybody else have something to add on that piece?
I'm going to go with the next question. Oh, go ahead, Noelle. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to add, I think that some of the questions around hate crimes and racial profiling are addressed in the Peace Officer Accountability Bill by Representative Tai as well. Representative Tai, has written in there some of the accountability around misconduct and harassment. Is there specific language around racial harassment, Leslie, when it comes to that bill? I was thinking there are misconducts that are called out regarding race and profiling. Is that correct?
I can't accurately answer that, but we will address that.
Yeah, one of the torts that it addresses is called outrage. And so something like the use of racial slurs and things like that could fall under that.
Yeah, under outrage. Yes. So that is, I just wanted to bring that up because that's one of the things in Representative Tai's bill that I think is important for us to highlight in this conversation.
All right. And if any of the other panelists want to jump in, feel free. I have another question here from Jade. I really like it. How is necessary defined, and what are the guidelines for deciding last resort? And then it goes on, for all situations in which officers, supervisors must decide whether an action, whether it's a hot pursuit or use of force or use of deadly force, is necessary. How is their decision later evaluated? How do we cut out subjectivity? It's common for officers to exaggerate circumstances, and they may have a different idea of what necessary and last resort means than I and many others do. Great question.
When we were coming up with the language to use for this bill, we worked really closely with legislative staff because we know that so far, up until now, officers have avoided responsibility and accountability because of some squishiness in the law and some ambiguity, and because some of the language has really looked at what a reasonable officer would do in the circumstances. But all that language has sort of been stripped out. And now, we feel that the current language is as precise as we could get it, where last resort really means last resort, so that And there should be an evaluation as to whether de-escalation tactics were used. The bill outlines what de-escalation tactics look like. It also, in terms of defining things like imminent threat, it's not enough to just have something in your pocket somewhere, but actually you have to have tried to use it and been able to, and what you have in your hand had to have actually been able to cause significant bodily injury. It can't be a cell phone that someone thought was a weapon. And so we have really worked hard to make the language as precise as possible to close some of those loopholes that we have seen be used over the past decade in these kinds of police misconduct cases.
Anoka, can you address the question that Representative Clippert asked during the work session?
Sure. And, we know that actually police misconduct runs the gamut from everything from the use of a racial slur to a shooting and killing, and so the use of force bill really tries to look at all of that and really deal with sort of the daily occurrences of police harassment and misconduct in communities. But we were asked the question by Representative Clippert, well, what happens when someone's immediately shooting at a police officer? Well, then, of course, in that instance, there is, that is the time when deadly force can be used if it is, if the officer or another person's life is at risk. So it counts, I think, for all those circumstances and will significantly reduce the use of violence by police officers.
And one of the things we hear is that this is too restrictive and police hands are tied, but that's not the case. If they have an imminent threat, they are able to use deadly force.
That's right. And I think one of the other questions I saw in the chat was about, the failure of police reform over the past 50 years. And I just want to be very clear that these 5 bills have not been tried before in Washington State. This is a huge departure from the kind of police reform we have had for the past 50 years. And it is, and these would have been unthinkable a year ago. And it's amazing that the activism and the people's movements in this country have created this opportunity. And we really want to take the opportunity to have these bills and push them forward because it will change what we've been seeing.
So these bills came from our families who are part of the coalition. They came up, the families' experience and what happened to their loved ones created this list of priorities. And then we all started working and supporting it. Davida, who has had lots of experience in the police practices area, came up with the idea of we need a statewide requirement for it that's in law, not just a training requirement, but a requirement for de-escalation. And then working with Anoka came up with that part of the use of force bill. So this is really a grassroots effort. This is a big coalition. We listen to each other, and we're working hard on a package that is bold and makes a difference. We're not here for work on the edges. We want to make a big change in police culture.
We have a question from someone named Les Liggins. Are retired or former law enforcement allowed to function as independent investigators? And there was also another question concerning the independent investigations as far as where will the qualifications and people that would be doing the investigations, where would they be coming from, or what fields would you be pulling from? So that's a good question for our task force member, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you for that. With it, like I said, there's going to be a transition period. So within the first 5 years, former law enforcement would be able to, be hired on. The goal is to transition to completely non-law enforcement, but professional criminal investigators. And so I know that there has recently started at one of our local community colleges a program to start training folks to do these types of investigations. And so part of what our hope is that we can start recruiting from that program and get professionals trained through there. There has been discussion about a separation period. So after, I want to say 3 to 5 years, you would be eligible for working in this agency. Somebody can correct me if my timeframes are wrong there, but we've heard from different professionals, experts, that there's these types of investigations can be done by archaeologist type. Those are some of the type of investigations, investigators that have been mentioned. But I mean, we are embarking on a new area, so we are going to need to train up folks, and in the beginning rely on those who have the expertise, and have them train up our investigators, our non-law enforcement investigators going forward.
So there were questions on bill numbers, and I know Anoka mentioned some of that, but please, we'll be posting things on our Facebook page. We're in the process of getting a website up, and that'll be available. And we're using ActionNet to send messages to folks. So we'll be doing calls to action. I'm looking at the time, and I think I'm going to turn it over to Malou to close this out.
Thank you, everyone. I wanted to first appreciate all of you for spending your lunch hour with us, learning about these important bills, these issues that are very important to our communities. I want to thank our speakers, our family members in particular, who share their stories over and over, and who have been working, especially spending very dedicated time to see this change. We hope that you continue to support our movement, that we continue to be in communication. As Leslie mentioned, we will be following up. Our Facebook page, as Noel mentioned, is live, and we will be updating with bill numbers, with any information, calls to action. We want you to remain engaged, as this is a very important time. We've been waiting for many years for this to happen. Police accountability impacts everyone, every community, every person from different walks of lives. So we appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone. If anyone on the speaker platform would like to say anything else, please feel free, but we will be following up with responses to some of the questions that we didn't get to, and most of that information will be posted on our Facebook page. Anyone else?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to everyone, and I'm excited to be working with everyone that participated today. We had close to 200 participants and many people following on Facebook today.